Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously intense half-century of history, 1900 to 1950. Think about it. In just 50 years, a massive global empire was fractured and a brand new republic was born. We're going to trace exactly how that happened, step by step.
To guide us, we'll be following a definitive educational timeline of the Indian national movement. What's really cool is seeing it presented side by side in both Tamil and English. Using a scale of 1 unit to 10 years, it beautifully captures how this foundational, shared history is taught across India's incredibly diverse linguistic landscape. We're going to use this as our roadmap today.
To make sense of this massive 50-year escalation, we've broken it down into 5 key eras: the seeds of rebellion, mass action and uprisings, marches, pacts, and politics, the final push, and finally, birth of a republic.
All right, let's kick things off with Part 1, the seeds of rebellion, focusing on the foundational shifts of the early 1900s.
Everything really kicks into gear in 1905 with the partition of Bengal and the Swadeshi movement. And almost immediately, the political landscape just fractures. We see the Muslim League forming in 1906, right before the ideological Surat split in 1907. Now, the British tried to appease this growing unrest with the Minto-Morley reforms in 1909, but the tension was just too high. It ends up boiling over into targeted violence, like the Ash murder in 1911. Literally, in just 6 years, administrative lines became actual ideological battle lines.
But running right parallel to all that unrest, various identities were rapidly organizing themselves. For example, the first Hindu Mahasabha conference convened at Haridwar in 1915. Then, by 1916, there's this massive push for self-governance with the Home Rule League, and that's paired with the unified front of the Lucknow Pact. Fast forward just 1 year to 1917, and the Champaran movement marks a totally crucial pivot, a real shift toward localized, grassroots agrarian issues.
Moving right along to Part 2, mass action and uprisings. This covers the incredibly volatile shift from 1919 to 1922.
Now, 1919, that is an absolute watershed year. You have the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms and the deeply oppressive Rowlatt Act, which immediately sparked the devastating Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And that singular, horrific tragedy triggers a brutal domino effect. We're talking consecutive years of rebellion, the massive non-cooperation movement in 1920, the Malabar Rebellion in 1921, and it all violently culminates in the Chowri Chowra incident in 1922.
So if we focus in for a second, 1919 was the ultimate pressure cooker. The tragedy of Jallianwala Bagh acted as this intense catalyst. It instantly transformed localized, regional frustrations into a mobilized, nationwide fury by 1920. The rules of engagement had, for sure, permanently changed.
That brings us to Part 3, marches, pacts, and politics. Here we see the dual strategies defining the 1930s. The 1930s introduce a really fascinating rhythm to the movement. It's essentially mass physical demonstration followed up by intense political negotiation. The decade kicks off with the legendary 1930 Dandi March, but that boots-on-the-ground protest literally forces the ink-on-paper Gandhi-Irvin Pact in 1931. That's quickly followed by the Communal Award and the Pune Pact in 1932, and then the decade rounds out with a major legislative milestone, the first Congress Ministry in Provinces in 1937.
Just think about the sheer evolution within that single decade. On one hand, in 1930, you have people marching miles to the sea just to make salt in a pure act of civil disobedience, right? But then, just 7 years later, in 1937, those exact same forces are formally establishing provincial ministries. It is the classic hallmark of a maturing movement, weaponizing both street-level protest and high-level political administration.
Okay, on to Part 4, the final push. This is the frenetic escalation of the 1940s.
So, as World War II is just raging globally, we see a rapid, honestly almost desperate succession of attempts by the British to negotiate power. The legislative steps come quick, jumping from the August Offer in 1940 to the Cripps Mission in 1942. Then, as the war wraps up, they push the Wavell Plan and Simla Conference in 1945 before landing finally on the Cabinet Mission in 1946.
But here's the catch. While politicians were busy drafting those offers, the streets were entirely on fire. Running exactly parallel to those legislative steps, the Lahore Resolution hits in 1940. In 1942, the massive Quit India movement rises up in direct answer to the Cripps Mission. In 1946, that year is absolute historical chaos. You have direct action, the formation of the interim government, and the RIN revolt all clashing at the exact same time.
The pressure at this point was completely unsustainable. And all of this rapid-fire escalation, decades of broken pacts, massive marches, and endless missions, it finally tips the scales. 1947, India wins its independence.
Which leads us to Part 5, Birth of a Republic, the final milestone.
Now, independence in 1947 wasn't actually the finish line. The legal framework of the country still had to be built from the ground up. 1950 marks that absolutely critical shift. The Constitution is enacted, officially transforming a newly independent nation into a formalized republic. And this milestone closes out one of the most turbulent, transformative 50-year chapters in modern history.
When you step back and look at this relentless escalation, the split factions, the legislative chess games, the massive uprisings, it really forces a question. How does a foundation forged in 50 years of absolute fire continue to shape the DNA and political survival of the world's largest democracy today? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.